Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Now that my two obligatory informative videos are done for the day, I'm going to do yet another informative video because today I'm going to talk about this same thing that people have been arguing about, but we're going to keep it informative and we're actually going to bring in a very, very credible source to discuss this exact topic. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on scaling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Alright, there's been me on here lately discussing, look, I don't like what AlphaDestiny's doing. I don't like what he's promoting with these heavy partials. I think heavy partials are not really a good idea. I don't think they're particularly useful for most lifters' needs. Now, a bunch of people have come in and said, well, this is what he's doing. It's for hypertrophy training. He doesn't care about this. He doesn't care about that. We don't care about this and that. Okay, that's fine, guys. That's absolutely fine. You know what? You guys all have a reason to have your own training goals. You know, you own your body. You own your mind. You have a right to set any training goal that you want. And if your goal is to get the most massive traps possible, and that's what you care about, that's like your obsession in life, and that's more important to you than anything else in the world, okay, that's your right to have that goal. I'm not going to argue with that. But there are right and wrong ways to go about doing something. And when it comes to these really heavy partial deadlifts, not just, I mean, partial deadlifts in general, but then again, you've got the ones way above the knee, these little ones that are actually probably less than half the range of motion of even a normal above the knee deadlift. Basically, if you can do above the knee with twice your max deadlift, you're probably not just above the knee. You're way, way higher than that. And I've discussed already why that doesn't produce extra muscle fiber growth or anything else, no extra fiber recruitment. But what I'm going to hop to, because Dr. Mike Israetel posted something on his wall yesterday. I don't know if he's been following any of this debate. Never asked him. I actually haven't talked to the guy in probably a year. So I don't know if he knows what's going on here, but this topic sure came up. And people say, well, who's he? Why does his opinion matter? Well, because he's a professor of kinesiology. All right, this is what he does. He is the person teaching your future strength and conditioning coaches who are working on their undergrad degrees in exercise science, biomechanics, human physiology, all of that stuff. He, again, has a PhD in the field. He is a professor. He's a researcher. He coaches people. He competes in bodybuilding and he competes in jiu-jitsu. So he competes in a performing art and he competes in a real sport also. So this is someone who I think it's fair to say he's not going to be right all the time. We're free to disagree with him, but he's probably a pretty good source of information. Anything he says regarding training is probably not going to be far off. And I think most people would agree with that. He's probably more qualified than most of us to discuss this. And here's something he said about hypertrophy training, and I'm going to quote him here. This was on his wall yesterday. An idea about minimizing fatigue and hypertrophy training. Although all hard training and stress to the body produces fatigue, some kinds of stress seem to produce more fatigue than others. One kind of stress that seems to produce a disproportionately high amount of fatigue is termed axial loading, or in less fancy terms, downward force on the spine. The most common source of such loading is by doing exercises that place the barbell on the back or front of the neck or hold the bar in the hands while the individual is upright or close to upright. Examples are squat, front squats, deadlifts, and overhead presses. When we are training for size, the local stimulus to the muscles, such as the delts and the press or the quads and the squat, are what we want. But we also want some stimulus and fatigue from axial loading involved. And while this loading does provide some great trap ab and erector work, it also produces vastly more fatigue than we might want to spare in some cases, especially for the bigger and stronger lifters that already have a good core development and are seriously pushing their recovery demands to the limit. All right, what he's saying here and what he says through the rest of a lot of this, he gives ideas about not that you need to do zero axial loading. It's that if your goal is purely hypertrophy, if you're purely in a hypertrophy phase of your training, too much axial loading will absolutely impede recovery. What does impeded recovery do? It means you can't train as hard again as soon. Not as big of a deal for people on huge amounts of drugs, but drug-free lifters, quite frankly, need to be hitting every body part in their body at least twice a week, and to be honest, that probably isn't enough to get maximal muscle growth for a completely drug-free lifter. Probably 3 times is probably better. Again, if you're seeking maximum muscle growth for people who aren't aided by anabolics, because your muscles only grow up to 48 hours after you train them. And if you're impeding your recovery, it's going to be longer before you can train again hard. It might be longer before you can even train again in general with any amount of intensity. And sometimes excessive fatigue can make it to where even your performance is going to suffer even a week later. So again, there's a fine balance between stimulation, overall fatigue, all of that stuff for gaining maximum muscle mass. Now, axial loading is usually the king of developing athleticism. Like if you're looking for full body strength and power, axial loading exercises are king. Squats, overhead pressing, push presses, deadlifts, power cleans, all this stuff, these are bread and butter exercises to get your entire body big and strong. But you also can't do huge amounts of workload with them sometimes. And the stronger you get, the harder it gets. It's something I've talked about a lot in the past, is that the more advanced you get, you're going to find that working with the same percentages, with the same reps and sets, meaning, you know, you might reach a certain point where you can do so many reps and sets with a percentage of your max, and as you get bigger and stronger and more advanced, you're going to find you can't replicate that. That you need longer to recover after doing that. So you've got to back those total tonnages down because your recovery doesn't always equal your tonnages. A big part of that has to do with the type of fatigue exercises do. Axial loading creates fatigue, and that fatigue is very much relative to the weight you are putting on the spine, meaning 400 pounds of axial loading is going to be less fatiguing than 600 pounds of axial loading. The heavier weight that puts more weight on the spine is going to cause more systematic fatigue in your body. It is going to slow down recovery from training. So while axial fatigue has some benefits, if you're overdoing it, it is going to massively negatively impact your recovery. And what he's saying is that that's not the best way to hypertrophy. It might be the best way to gain certain performance elements, but if your goal is purely size, if you're training for size right now, and that's your only goal, you're in a hypertrophy phase in your training, or you're even on a hypertrophy day. Let's say you're running some sort of concurrent periodization or undulating periodization, things like that, right? Your hypertrophy only days, to where you're working with really the high reps or the higher volumes, you might need to limit axial loading. And he gives a lot of tips on limiting axial loading, but you guys need to remember what we've talked about before. Partial reps don't increase hypertrophy purely by adding weight. They give the same, and in the best case scenario, they give the same hypertrophy that a full range of motion does with a lighter weight, as long as they're taken to similar amounts of fatigue. But here's the thing, axial loading, the more of it you place, the more it impedes recovery, even with the same amount of workload done to the muscles, okay? So if you did a partial rep with less range of motion, but a heavier weight, and did the same amount of rough volume with it, the heavier weight would cause more fatigue because of the compression of the spine. Does that make sense? It's not helping you, it's hurting your recovery at that point. And this is the thing he says last. He goes through a bunch of different recommendations. I thought one of them was interesting, by the way, with pen leg rows for rowing. So basically as far down as you can go. Pen leg rows are fantastic. So are chin-ups and pull-ups, because they're one of the massive back builders that work pretty much the entire upper body. All of those are without axial loading. Which is, again, a lot of my non-axial loading exercises are chin-ups and pen leg rows. Almost everything else I do is for very low reps, so the axial loading. Those are out of there. He did comment on that, though, and that's interesting. Okay, and what he put for his last point, he goes, I can't emphasize this point enough, which is why it's the last one. When you already have weight on your back or in your hands, you might as well do full range of motion to get all the benefits of it. And because full range of motion is harder, you might need less weight. Thoughtful bodybuilders should be squatting as low as possible and shoulder pressing through a full range of motion. Half squats and pump reps are great ways to maximize axial fatigue without maximizing hypertrophic stimulation to the actual targeted muscles. I'm going to repeat that again. And he's basically saying partial reps are great ways to maximize axial fatigue without maximizing hypertrophic stimulus to the actual target muscles. In other words, doing heavier weights than you can do through a full range of motion for partials aren't stimulating any more muscle growth. In some cases, they stimulate less muscle growth, and that's something people aren't grasping with this concept. You're stimulating less muscle growth in some cases because you're not working the muscle through the full range of motion. So you sometimes might only be getting 95% of its potential because of the shorter reps, even with the heavier weight. But what he's saying is the heavier weight on the spine is impacting your recovery more so than if you had just done the full range of motion with a lighter rep. So you might be gaining less muscle and creating more fatigue in your body. That shouldn't be your goal ever, at least in a hypertrophy type phase of training. That should never be a goal. So when you look at what he's saying here, and anyone who's promoting doing heavy partial reps, particularly on an exercise that puts weight directly on the spine, compresses the spine, whether it's a squat, a deadlift, an overhead press, a row really upright. Yet another reason you shouldn't be doing those. I mean, quite frankly, you get less lat development. You get less lat development the more upright you get, less lat stimulation, but more compression of the spine. So he's basically telling people this isn't a good idea. So this is someone with absurd credentials in the area, extremely knowledgeable, tons of real-world experience, tons of educational experience, tons of experience teaching other educators and teaching coaches, is telling you that this isn't a good idea if your goal is gaining size right now, that it's a bad idea. Yet it's being popularized here on YouTube. We see the problem here. Hopefully people grasping this. This is a problem. And now, no one is denying that things like this build the traps. And that's the thing that's frustrating more than anything. So many people have come in these discussions and they're saying, well, you know, are you saying it can't grow? Of course it grows the traps. No one said it doesn't grow the traps. No one implied that it doesn't grow the traps. All I'm saying is there are other ways that grow the traps just as much. There are other things that are effective at it. And what you need to understand, people are talking about, again, doing rack pulls with double their deadlift. Double what they deadlift trying to stimulate their traps. They're fatiguing themselves. They're risking injury, guys. You can absolutely herniate a disc doing this. I don't care what anyone tells you that, oh, no, you can't, it's safe. No, it isn't. It is not safe for you to load your spine with twice what you can deadlift. All right, the compressive stress there, I don't care how strong you are, you can absolutely herniate a disc doing that. And if you do, you are completely screwed. All right, you are completely screwed if that happens, and that can absolutely do it. And anyone who's telling you it isn't does not have your best interest in mind. They're going to hurt you. I'm trying to keep you guys from getting hurt. I'm not doing that to be a dick. I'm not doing it to even attack Strap-On Destiny. I'm doing it because I saw what he was promoting and said, hey, this is not good. This is bad. This is going to hurt people. No one's saying it can't grow the traps, but you know what also grows the traps? Full range of motion. If your goal, like right now, you said, my traps are such a lagging body part that they need extra attention. Well, if your traps are a lagging body part to the point to where you're willing to risk herniating your disc, why don't you step back and say, okay, what are the proven methods of blowing up traps for people who have lagging traps? Maybe I should do those instead of hurting myself. All right? And if you have a lagging body part, do you guys really think doing a heavy partial weight with really low reps for short range of motion is really the best way to bring up a truly lagging body part? I mean, look, I like low reps for gaining size with high volume. I like accumulation training. Is that really the best way to do it? I've seen guys blow up their traps, guys who had some of the biggest traps I've ever seen. They did their conventional list, but they wanted really massive traps. Okay, and some people want really massive traps. I personally don't understand the appeal in someone wanting traps that are bigger than they need to be to deadlift heavy or overhead press heavy. In fact, most of the guys out there, if you think that you need traps that are way bigger than you're going to develop doing 10 rep sets with 405 on the deadlift or 10 rep sets with 135 pounds with a strict front press or whatever, that's fine. You want bigger traps than that? I don't necessarily see the appeal, but if you do, a time-proven method, do heavy shrugs. Shrugs. I've seen guys with some of the biggest traps I've ever met. I knew a guy who had absolutely enormous traps for his size. Pretty good sized guy too. He used to do shrugs with like 315. That's as heavy as he went. He would do 10 rep sets for a full range of motion. He didn't bounce it. He went all the way down, all the way up, so that he worked the muscle all the way to the top and then let it stretch at the bottom. So he let it pull down and stretch at the bottom, and he worked the muscle up and down through its maximum range of motion with a nice moderate weight, 315 pounds. That's all he used on it for sets of 10. But he focused on doing the entire range of motion and to maximize what he got out of that set, because he was isolating a muscle. And you know what? I can tell you guys, putting 315 on your spine, particularly if you're doing other big lifts, just to build your traps up, is going to be safer than throwing 1,000 pounds on there and trying to do rack pulls for 3 inches. It's going to be a lot safer. It's far less likely to injure you, and it's going to be a lot easier to recover from. So, okay, this is my point to that. People who really are saying, look, my traps aren't growing, they're a lagging point, so why would you do this? There are conventional, proven methods to bring up lagging body parts. The traps are no different than any other. People for decades have used heavy shrugs, moderately heavy shrugs. They don't even have to be super heavy. You don't have to do 500-pound shrugs to bring your traps up. Again, I've seen guys with massive traps doing high rep sets as light as 315 and bringing up massive traps. Can absolutely be done with just a plain normal exercise. That is a very low risk. You're not likely to get hurt doing that. And that will leave you recovery to go do real lifts. All right, people are wasting all of their recovery, risking injury just to bring up a single lagging muscle, when there are time-proven methods to do so. Come on, guys, there's no point in doing that. Don't be silly. Don't injure yourself. Don't over-fatigue yourself doing this. Stop listening to nonsense telling you to do that. If your traps are that big of an obsession to you, I don't get it, but you know what? You have a right to obsess what you have a right to obsess over. It's your body. If that's what you want to do, then do some full range of motion shrugs at the end of every one of your workouts. All right, every time you train, start doing shrugs for as much weight as you can do full range of motion on with good form for 3 sets of 10 at the end of every single workout. You do that for 6 months, and I promise you that you will have the biggest traps you've ever had in your life. It just isn't that difficult, guys. It really isn't. To the point to where people need to do stuff so insane and absurd and exotic. And that right there, you have someone with amazing credentials looking at, if you look at what he said, using something like this for hypertrophy is absolutely absurd. And anyone telling you otherwise is extremely ignorant. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.